This is Chapter 14 of the American Government class, looking at foreign policy. We're going to break this up into two parts. This will be part one for this lecture. Let's talk about the primary goals that foreign policy has. Again, we're looking primarily from the point of view of U.S. foreign policy, but these are some common factors here between other particularly democratic type states. One of the major goals of foreign policy, of course, is to provide national security. We've got a military. We'll be talking about some of that here in a minute. We've got homeland security, but we're looking to protect U.S. citizens and U.S. borders from foreign threats, disruptions of supplies. Also, a goal of foreign policy is to promote the economy, and it does that through interactions with other states, such as trade, foreign investment, which we've talked about, protecting perhaps domestic industries. That depends on what the particular goal is of any individual administration, whether it might want to use protectionism or use less protectionism and go out and engage more in the international capitalist realm. Another thing that foreign policy is tasked to do is maintain the international institutions that have been established over the years, particularly since the end of World War II, when we set the foundation for our modern era of international relations, where we set up various international organizations such as the United Nations, which we'll look at that in a little bit, World Trade Organization. And these are organizations that are created by the states for the most part in order to delegate issues for them to focus on, such as human rights, the environment, even peacekeeping operations and health operations as well. It's a little bit more efficient for states to perhaps delegate some of those things out, whereas other issues such as national security or more serious economic, particularly domestic economic issues, the state would want to keep that more under their own domain. But international institutions, very important part of the global system. With respect to where foreign policy originates, particularly in the United States, the Constitution sets it up where the president's office is responsible for initiating foreign policy and somewhat maintaining that on a regular basis. We'll look at some of the conflicts here in a minute between Congress and the president, but the Constitution lays it out. The president is commander-in-chief of the armed forces, which of course is tasked with protecting us from foreign threats. Part of the civilian control of the military. So we talked about this before, where the president has to be flexible and able to react to certain crises. The president has also been given the power to negotiate the treaties. So he or his envoys or his Department of State representatives are out there negotiating those treaties and signing the original agreement. And then, of course, it has to come back and be approved by the Senate. The president also has, according to the Constitution, appointment power, which includes a lot of government officials that deal with foreign policy, particularly in Homeland Security or the Defense Department, and particularly the State Department. Also appoints all the ambassadors to all of the states that represent America in those states. Early on, the United States had what you might call somewhat of a unilateral type of foreign policy, and this was somewhat influenced very early on because of the entanglements that we were involved in at our founding, particularly with Britain, and then very early on, even under Washington's administration, there was conflicts between Britain and France. And Washington's farewell address kind of set the tone that lasted for a long time. Washington advised that we should steer clear of permanent alliances with any portion of the foreign world. There's a lot of stuff going on out there, might be worth focusing on our own development in internal security. And that did have a fairly long-standing influence as far as maintaining that tone. It wasn't really until the late 1800s, this is just a little timeline that I got from another textbook. It wasn't until the late 1800s to where we really started to get involved militarily in other countries, primarily the Spanish-American War, which was, we see a lot of these conflicts here, even the intervention in China. We were starting to have a little bit of an imperialist tendency. We were looking at the empires of Britain and France, and that even Germany. So the United States was probably feeling a little bit left behind, that, well, we've got these other interests opening up, particularly in Asia and China and Japan. So maybe we should start dabbling in that. Got involved in the Spanish-American War, which literally left us as the Philippines as one of our territories, and then we very quickly gotten involved in a war with the Philippines in a civil war where they wanted to get out from under us. So it didn't go very well. We had numerous interventions in that period, primarily prior to World War I, some imperialist type of interventions, and then after World War I, that was downplayed quite a bit. We did have some sporadic operations in China to support a new Republican government there in the 20s. We were quite isolationist in the 20s and the 30s, and it wasn't until December 7th, 1941, until that literally changed overnight, got involved into World War II. So obviously we could talk for hours about these conflicts, World War II, Korean War. But what I want to focus on here for just a few minutes is the aftermath of World War II, where we were trying to come together and set the tone for a world that's going to be a little bit more coordinated and organized. So we set up the United Nations, the winners of World War II, established the Security Council. But very quickly after World War II, we started to grow suspicious, and vice versa, with the Soviet Union, who had been our ally in World War II. But very quickly, because they were communist, we were pushing away from them. So what I want to focus on here for a few minutes is the Cold War period, which came about very quickly after the end of World War II, and particularly by 1949, when the Soviets had established that they had an atomic bomb. Well, then the arms race was on. So what we're seeing during this period was two major ideologies: autocratic communism versus democratic capitalism, the lack of communication and trust between these two. So these armed races and then these missile races and then the space race, all of this grew out of the Cold War, and there was a few hot wars that came out of that, what we call proxy wars, such as the Korean War and the Vietnam War, neither of which anybody actually won. Talked about the arms race, and then particularly as we get into the 1950s, in order to avoid all-out war, both sides were making ample use of covert operations. The CIA was quite active, particularly during the 50s and early 60s, with keeping tabs on any communist activities. The Soviet Union eventually did fall. Lots of evidence in hindsight that it was not a very stable system. After a while, it was not able to take care of all of its people. The communist system was showing its flaws. They were spending so much on military and weapons that it was not able to spread wealth or prosperity to people. And literally in the mid-'80s, the premier of the Soviet Union, Gorbachev, actually reached out to the British and American leaders and said, we don't think this is going to sustain itself. We need to start looking at changing. We want to open up a little bit transparent, potentially more democratic, although that was very difficult to pull off very quickly. And then certainly most interested in getting plugged into a more market economy in order to alleviate their economic woes. But prior to that, the concept of deterrence and containment were the major factors. That's what kind of led to some of these wars here, where we wanted to prevent the spread of communism. So the arms race was driven by the deterrence. If we have more weapons than you, then that would prevent a war. And then the containment policy was to prevent communism from spreading. So all of that kind of worked over the decades, and the Soviet Union could not sustain itself. And then in the late 80s, particularly 1989, all of the satellites around the Soviet Union started to reform their systems, and within less than a year, the Communist Cold War, or particularly the concept of the Berlin Wall, the separation between the democratic capitalist world and this communist world, had pretty much crumbled down. And then in 1991, the Soviet Union officially fell apart. And at that time is where we would say that we had somewhat of a unipolar world, where the United States was the sole superpower. And in addition, since communism had fallen along with the Soviet Union, there was a consensus that, well, looks like capitalism has prevailed. And that kind of initiated a move towards this global capitalist, this globalization that we've been seeing over the past few decades, that it's obviously has had its problems. We've touched on that a little bit about what some of the concerns are with capitalism, but for the most part, still moving in that general direction since the Cold War. So looking at particularly since the end of the Cold War, we've had relatively few military involvements. Now, of course, in the 80s, there was some involvements there in South America working against socialist-leaning regimes. But since the fall of the Soviet Union, there was intervention in Somalia that turned violent, and that kind of put America off a little bit from getting involved in other situations. And that's one of the reasons why the Bosnian War, part of the NATO peacekeepers were sent there to prevent civil war in Bosnia. The war had been raging for a couple of years before that even happened, and the Rwandan conflict there that happened so quickly, and in the Western world pretty much just stood back and watched it happening. But the world dramatically changed with the World Trade Center attacks of 9/11. Since 9/11, we engaged in a war in Afghanistan, and we are still there. Afghanistan is still a very unstable country. There's a high likelihood that if we completely pulled out of Afghanistan, then the Taliban, which was there in 2001, one of the reasons why we invaded Afghanistan was to get rid of the Taliban, which was sympathetic with Al-Qaeda, and then go after Al-Qaeda / Osama bin Laden. Been there for almost 20 years, and it's still a very unstable state. And ironically, if the United States pulled completely out, it's possible the Taliban could exert control. It's hard to say whether or not the Taliban would behave the same way they did back in 2001, but still have not shown to be very sympathetic to American interests. And America is actually trying to negotiate with the Taliban as we speak to see what might be possible post-U.S. involvement. The preemptive war in Iraq was also on the heels of this war on terror, the war or the invasion in order to topple Saddam Hussein. A lot of the justification of that was based on the idea that Americans would be more acceptable to going in and invading Iraq because of the heightened fear of terrorism and perhaps the a little bit better ability to sell that war in Iraq on the heels of this 9/11. The ground war in both of these areas, both Afghanistan and Iraq, turned out to be very expensive, with a lot more casualties than expected. President Obama was elected twice to try to get out of these wars. Then the drone activity picks up. There's less collateral damage with the drones, but again, that is something that does have consequences. And then the argument of increased surveillance versus invasion of privacy. The courts have had to deal with that. We do want to prevent terrorism, and most people seem to be okay with surveillance, but then, of course, how far might that go to where it could be an invasion of privacy? And then we're still dealing with how to approach the continuing effects of the war on terror, or some of the other Middle East involvements such as Syria, or the potential of the rise of ISIS in various other regions of the world. For the rest of this lecture, let's do mostly a review, because the president's power, who's tasked with initiating and maintaining foreign policy, we've already talked quite a bit about the expanded power of the president over time. And since we are talking about foreign policy here, much of this expanded power has to do with foreign policy, as we'll review particularly three major reasons as to how the president's power has expanded over the past several decades. One of which we've already talked about was the blanket resolutions, where Congress gives the president an authorization to use military force. In some ways, that has been considered somewhat of a blank check, to where the president has been tasked to take care of this problem, whatever it takes, and that has escalated to full-scale war in several cases that we've touched on already. For example, 1964, there was an incident in the Gulf of Tonkin. President Johnson was running for re-election. He was wanting to try to resolve this situation in Vietnam, and at least particularly during an election year, to demonstrate to the people that he was aggressively trying to take care of this. And the Gulf of Tonkin resolution gave him overwhelming authority to take care of that problem in Vietnam, and it escalated into a very, very disastrous Vietnam War, where 58,000 American soldiers were eventually killed by the time we got out of Vietnam in 73 or so. The average age of those 58,000 soldiers killed was 19 years old. Now, the 19, I was going to jump ahead, but in 1991, the Gulf War resolution was actually more controversial than these others, but it was generally more successful when we pushed Saddam Hussein back into his borders after he had invaded Kuwait. But what we see is that a decade later, on the heels of 9/11, the Bush administration was looking to go back and take care of what the first Bush administration may not have finished. So the push then towards invading Iraq was it's probably about a 70% overall approval rate. I know it was 70% of Congress, and about 65% of American citizens in general were in favor of the Iraq War, even though they could not get a UN resolution. That one, as I've already said, did not turn out very well. Mixed results. It did get rid of Saddam Hussein, but it was a lot more expensive and a lot more casualties than what was expected. Also, it stirred up the Sunni versus Shia divide of Islam, which has been very conflictual ever since. Got caught in that civil war and then that has spread to other states. Now, 2001 War on Terror resolution was kind of what started that, and that was almost unanimous, particularly in the aftermath of 9/11. Within a couple of weeks, it was virtually unanimous that we would go to Afghanistan to try to take care of the terrorist problem, resulted in the Afghanistan war, which lingered for several years and we're still there with no real satisfying conclusion in sight. And because of the reluctance of Congress to go back and look at these conflicts and perhaps come up with new resolutions, 3 presidents now have actually used this same War on Terror resolution to look at other conflicts such as Syria and Yemen and potentially some others. So the president has gathered quite a bit of power over the years through this concept of a authorization to use military force, which we're calling blanket resolutions here. They're literally delegating, without declaring war, delegating a president to take care of problem, and that's giving him considerable power to potentially escalate it into full war. And of course that could creep up on you, but when you're trying to solve a problem and you're trying to win this situation, whatever that means, and it's harder to win wars in today's world, then it could just continuously to get worse. After the Vietnam War, Congress actually came back in and says, well, maybe we need to rethink this and try to take a little bit of power away from the president on that. And they passed what was called the War Powers Resolution in 1973, which they set strict conditions for war, fairly logical there. The president has to consult with Congress before sending troops. Troops deployed no more than 60 days, and the Congress can withdraw the troops. Now let's address these very briefly. The president can do lots of things before sending actual troops. He can send what are called advisors or reconnaissance, even engineers, even lots of personnel that is backed up by a lot of military equipment that he doesn't necessarily have to call troops. So this one is fairly easy to get around, can do a lot of mobilization before notifying Congress that he's sending military troops. The troops deployed no more than 60 days. This one is somewhat impractical because let's just say you are mobilizing for a potential conflict and you're spending a lot of money sending thousands, perhaps 500,000 troops, and you're building airfields and you're building barracks and you're shipping over half tracks on aircraft carriers. And then in 60 days, after all that massive amount of mobilization and manpower and expense, and Congress says, okay, bring it all back. That's not likely to happen. So this one is somewhat impractical. This provision right here, however, is what killed this whole resolution. Congress put in there that, yes, if we do not like how it's going, we can withdraw troops. However, the Supreme Court, a few years later, this concept of the legislative veto was made it before the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court shot that down and said this is unconstitutional. Sorry, Congress, you can't do that. This violates the separation of powers clause. Congress can't authorize and then say after delegating it to the president to conduct the war as is tasked in the Constitution, then they violate that and say no, we're going to do that instead, pull the troops back. Can't have your cake and eat it too. Nixon vetoed that, as most presidents probably would, because that would be taking away some potential power. Congress did override that. However, as I've said with these points here just made, this War Powers Resolution has been virtually ineffective. And the Congress at the end of the Iraq War, actually there was a couple of heavyweight politicians on both sides of the aisle that were trying to come up with a new one, and that just fell off the table because we still have For one, there's not enough political will for Congress to do that. But then there's that separation of powers clause that they would always have to be straddling as well. So this will be something that we will be dealing with. We've already talked a little bit about executive agreements. That's where the president, another expanded power, has the ability to reach out and make agreements with other countries or perhaps with a small group of countries. And they're not approved by the Senate, but particularly under that administration, they have the same effect of treaties. The tone was set under FDR, where he was trying to work out some agreements, particularly with the Soviet Union and Britain, in order to prepare for the potential of getting involved in World War II. The destroyers for bases deal, where he gave UK 50 old destroyers for a 99-year lease on naval bases in the Atlantic. And so the president was pretty much set. The court went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court, on a previous agreement with Soviet Union, the Supreme Court ruled in favor of the president, saying that the president has to have the flexibility to make these agreements. So that pretty much set the tone, and now almost all international agreements are these executive agreements because there's just too much polarization in the Senate for them to come up with a 2/3 of approval on a treaty, and even something such as the Paris Accords, which would technically have been a treaty, but Obama knew that the Senate would not approve that, so he just makes it an agreement, and then the next president comes in, can tear that agreement up. If that agreement, such as the Paris Accords, had been taken to the Senate and the Senate had approved that into law, well, then the subsequent president could not do that. So this is part of the trade-off here. The president has more flexibility to make these agreements, but they could likely be temporary. And there's only been probably just 3 or 4 actual treaties that have been signed and approved by the Senate within the last decade or so, and all of them have been fairly routine extradition agreements with states such as Ecuador, which is somewhat of a no-brainer that we would want an extradition treaty with a South American country. Executive orders, that's where the president has the power to lay down a new rule or a new procedure or even a structural change in the executive branch, which is a big branch of the government. It could have far-reaching ramifications. So looking at some examples of executive orders, particularly from the foreign policy view, back in 1975, President Gerald Ford banned political assassinations. This happened not long after what was called the Church Report, which had delved into a lot of the activities that the CIA had been involved in, particularly in the 50s, where they were involved with some military coups and actually participated in an assassination of a Congo leader, as well as planning the assassinations of a few leaders such as Castro. When this report came out, we were still in the middle of the Cold War, but the administration says, all right, we want to make a statement here and say this is not how we want to conduct our business. We do not want to allow our own agencies to engage in this type of activity. So that was an executive order where political assassinations were banned. In 1979, Jimmy Carter was dealing with the Iran hostage crisis, and one of the things that he did to try to get the new leadership of Iran to the table was to freeze the Iranian assets. So there was a lot of wealth that the new leadership in Iran could have accessed and tapped into or brought back home. They did not have access to that because Carter froze that. Unfortunately, that didn't really help with the hostage crisis, and they didn't release the hostages until the day the next president, Ronald Reagan, took office. So that was a big blow to Carter's last year of his administration and probably contributed somewhat to him not getting reelected. After 9/11, there was lots of activity in order to try to set up this framework for the war on terror. And President George W. Bush in 2002 established through an executive order, the Office of Homeland Security. And the leader of that group fairly quickly was saying that he might not have enough power if it was just an executive office of the president, just an internal office where he was advising the president. So in 2003, Congress actually established the Department of Homeland Security, which is one of the 15 cabinet-level departments that we saw earlier in class. But it started off as an executive order under Bush. So that's a review of those three major expanded powers of the president that we've already talked about before. I wanted to go over them again because they're most applicable here to foreign policy. Current executive orders under the Trump administration include sanctions against North Korea, Venezuela, Iran, Syria, and in the next part, we'll actually talk a little bit more about sanctions as one of these tools of foreign policy. So we'll wrap it up here, and then we'll pick up next lecture in part 2.